Hello everyone and welcome back to season 2 of the PGN Podcast. This podcast has one simple message: to normalise the conversation on resilience, our environment and our future in a climate changed world, with our communities at the heart of it all. Our primary goal is to foster discussions about flooding, climate resilience and related environmental issues to better support communities. We're here to take a deeper dive into the conversations we began in season 1. We will be connecting hearts and minds, ambition, passion alongside our community and experts. Together we'll work towards building a more resilient future in our ever-changing world. I am Meshi Taka, the project lead for Project Groundwater Northumbria, which is what PGN stands for, and your host for this season. Let's jump right in. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, often known as the UN SDGs, serve as a widely recognized framework in professional and governmental contexts. Many organizations and governments have committed to these standard targets. So, what do they mean? What is their significance in our day-to-day life, and how can we all contribute towards achieving them? To that end, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Olli Jones. Hi, Olli. Welcome.
Hello, mate. How are you doing?
I'm good. Tell us a bit about you and your background.
Oh, wow. I usually say I'm a recovering architect. I was research director in an international architectural practice for a while, and then very sort of recently in the last 2 to 3 years, I've moved across very ferociously into the sustainability space and looked out across the market and said, who's doing the most exciting, most progressive, pioneering sustainability work? And found Cundall, who are a global multidisciplinary engineering consultancy, and was very fortunate to get a position with them as the Associate Director of Sustainability and Innovation there. So we've now got a massive team, over 180 people, who are working globally just on delivering sustainability and sustainable consulting on engineering projects, from everything ranging from small building projects all the way through to how do we plan an entire country and the infrastructure of an entire country to be most sustainable and to be resilient and to adapt to the future challenges of climate change.
SDGs, it's an acronym we hear often in many spaces, but to the ordinary Joe Blogs in the street.
So the Sustainable Development Goals probably date back to around 2012, maybe a bit before, were developed as 17 Sustainable Development Goals in writing in 2015, and they've got 169 objectives beneath them. But I think, and we'll definitely get onto this, what probably happened at the time was everybody made a load of pretty badges. Mm-hmm. And there was a really lovely diagram, and there was loads of lovely colours.
Lovely colours,
and yes. Everybody put all these lovely colours and all these lovely diagrams into their PowerPoints and their corporate documentation. I said, we're aligned with the SDGs. And you rightly asked the question almost 10 years later, well, what does it mean? Mm. And those SDGs cover, the goal and the spirit of them was to be about achieving peace and prosperity for people and nature. And that was the genuine spirit of the SDGs. And they cover everything from water quality to employment to equality and equity within our societies, all the way through to sustainable cities and communities. And how do we achieve those? And the SDGs tend to govern finance, how we invest in things globally, how we might make things better generally for people and planet. And they are the one thing that everybody has in common as a goal to strive for and to achieve to. But you'd probably be very right in saying, well, hang on a minute, what on earth have we done? Because the latest report in 2024, there's over just under half of those SDGs globally. Every year there's a big report that the UN do. Mm-hmm. Globally, just under half are minimal improvement, and over a third have gone backwards.
I read that report, and there was a lot of red in there. Mm-hmm. And then I read the ones that weren't red, and those weren't particularly exciting either. And when you look at the detail, I personally felt that something needs to change, but we'll get to that later on. Particularly in the last 5 years, is many organizations and governments declaring a climate emergency. What is a climate emergency?
you've only got to turn the television on to see a climate emergency
Yeah.
on any particular given day of the week in any particular country in the world. I mean, typically a climate emergency is captured in the public eye as a huge storm event, as a hot weather event, a cold weather event, a flooding event. But it's also things like drought. It's also things like, particularly when you look at the SDGs, because bear in mind, all of the SDGs centre around climate action and relate to the climate. You know, it can be about entire societies and food poverty or water security. So it's everything that's related to our environment that is currently at risk by our own actions. You know, the fact that we are increasing climate emissions, we are not addressing it at the rate that we need to. And therefore, these climate events are already in place. And the warming of the planet, as is well documented, and we'll not go into it here, is the cause of this.
But has it become a lot about signposting though? Like, oh look, we've declared a climate emergency and we're aligning with the goals.
Don't get me started on that.
It's kind of like what is the substance behind this? Because again, I think the first part of it is people hear SDG goals but don't necessarily know what the SDG goals entail, and you've kind of touched on some of it: poverty, well-being, and health, partnerships. Like, it's beyond, as somebody working within the built environment, it's beyond just the kind of technical. It's our entire community, is how we live. That's the purpose of it, really.
Yeah, I think we've been stuck in this realm and mode of making declarations for far too long. You know, and I think that's mainly because where there was a lack of leadership and a lack of knowledge sharing, and a typical commercial approach to trying to achieve an advantage without actually sharing the knowledge that was gained to get one there. So we talk about this, and actually everybody's declared, great. You know, everybody's made frameworks, great. You know, these are being refined time and time again. But the thing that we really need is action. The thing that we really need is implementation. And then we need to start talking about the problems and the challenges that we're all facing with action implementation. And that would just be the UK, which is an incredibly well-off country. And it's not even addressing all of the global issues that we've got with climate change, and some of the countries that actually really can't afford to make those changes and fund that level of green transition. So it is genuinely a global problem. But even nation by nation, country by country, we are not making the progress, even in our wealthiest countries, that we could make to even get close to achieving those SDGs.
Referring back to the report, there were some goals that seemed to be doing really well, and it seemed to be driven by capitalism. So the money-making goals seem to be doing rather well.
Well, I think it's you've got to take a look at people's integrity, haven't you, in those situations? And actually, nobody wants to go back to the table after all making this commitment. You know, all of those UN delegates and the countries represented by them made these commitments in 2015, nearly a decade ago. Every single year they've agreed to come back together, and the United Nations releases this report card as to how we're doing. Nobody wants to turn back up to school and say, "Oh, no, I didn't do my homework. You know, I never got that right." But I tell you what I did do. I read this book as well, and I did this. So the reporting, I think, has started to become creative by the fact that we've just haven't had the understanding, the right kind of government leadership in being able to push forward the right solutions. And it requires, the system that we've got is currently too siloed and too fractured. And actually, even at our government level, it requires a lot more joined up, holistic approaches. The SDGs themselves are a wonderful example of the fact that actually it's down in writing that health and well-being and employment and water quality, they're all related to the same thing. So why are we not addressing them and addressing those connections, those co-benefits, those unintended consequences, those compound effects at a local government level?
Because the system says no?
Because the system's broken.
The report is quite clear. It's calling for bigger action, more bolder action, more ambitious action, because we are off track. It's saying that we need to correct course and do that quickly as a matter of urgency. That's what that report says. Absolutely.
I think
nothing's changed.
No, and I think what it's showing is that while there's no financial penalty for our biggest players not achieving these goals, you know, even in areas where carbon offsets are mandated to large fossil fuel companies, there's still the most amazing gamemanship of creative accounting with regards to offsets. So we have to sort of reassess it and say, well, look, how this is affecting our lives on a daily basis, it's affecting the communities that we live in. It's affecting jobs, organizations and businesses that aren't particularly small. A lot of SMEs are affected by this at the moment. So we need to bring it back to a local level. I think the only way we can address this is by having a level of integrity, a level of action at a local level, and having a real joined up plan and trying to pioneer a response at that level, because all you really hear at that local level at the moment is, well, we can't afford it, or we don't have the right skills, or maybe if you've got someone that's really honest, well, we just don't really understand it. So that in itself needs addressing to begin with.
You were sharing some really interesting examples of work that has been done elsewhere. The opportunity to learn from other areas is one that I feel we don't explore enough. Like we still talk about, and this is kind of like in a national context, SDGs and looking at sustainable projects or looking at a different way of implementing more effective or practical systems for long-term investment, as opposed to kind of like a bolt-on. We did this little bit of work so we can tick a box to say, look, we delivered that goal. We still are looking inwards. So we're still looking at ourselves going, we have other priorities and it's a bit too difficult. And
I think the issue that we've got is that the green transition it's the world's biggest race to be second, because nobody wants to be first. Nobody wants to pay to be first. Nobody wants to fail first. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we've got in that space. In terms of looking internationally at what's happened and where the best examples are, there's the thing that defines the people who are furthest ahead is where are the biggest problems. So we've done an awful lot of projects in the Middle East where heat and temperature rises are going to be a significant challenge moving forward. And you might say, oh, well, actually, the Middle East can afford to do these programs and do these initiatives and take this approach. But that's not what's driving it. What's driving it is an acute realization that climate change has hit. Other area that we've done loads of work and loads of projects is in British Columbia, in Vancouver. Vancouver's been hit by some of the most devastating flooding, and in the same year has had a heat dome effect that killed over 600 residents. What we're seeing is the people who are attacking this first and most fiercely and putting the most money behind it and really pushing it are the people who are feeling it, really feeling it, and can afford to do something about it, because there's plenty of areas in the world that can't afford to do it about it and actually are feeling it much worse. The problem that we've got in the UK, I think, is that we kind of feel it sometimes, but we have a reasonably temperate climate compared to other places on the planet. And while we've got the means to change, the impetus still isn't quite understood in the fact that the climate risk moving forward with regards to flooding, with regards to heat, with regards to cold, which will be another one in this country as well over time, isn't quite understood enough. And the holistic benefits, as I said, and the unintended consequences and the co-benefits of our actions aren't understood. We can address public health by addressing climate change. We can address mental health and physical health by addressing climate change. We can address air quality by addressing climate change. And all of these things currently sit in different places with different people's pots of money, and they're all kind of doing something half right. But actually, if we took a holistic approach and said, right, let's really commit to reviewing where we are with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's align all of our corporate functions with those Sustainable Development Goals. Let's look at, we can't address everything at once, so what should we prioritize?
Transition.
Yeah. And start to make a proper plan about how do we achieve each of those 169 objectives within our own organization, within our own local government. So, and then gradually move that bar up. The British Columbia did and the local government there did a very good thing about 10 years ago, where they introduced a step code system to their planning policy, where they knew where they wanted to get everybody. But they basically said, well, we'll call this step code 1, step code 2. And then every year they just moved the step a little bit higher and brought industry along with them. Now, we don't have that level of progressive thinking in terms of our policy, in terms of our legislation. And the consequence of businesses in British Columbia not doing those things were that they were no longer competitive in the marketplace. So we need to think really a lot more savvier about how we deal with this in a commercial sense as well.
Commercial is an interesting part of the conversation. I'm pretty sure, I was talking to someone recently about our choices, really. So we have more choices now because we're not in that doom scenario yet. But the closer we get to that scenario, the less choices we have and the more expensive it gets.
Absolutely.
So if you were an independent party looking at this, you would say, and this is what we do in design all the time, one-on-one engineering, we talk about eliminate, reduce, isolate, control. Do everything you can to avoid getting to a worst case scenario. And yet, what we're seeing here is, even with the examples you're talking about, is the people doing the most are the ones that have absolutely no choice. It's a reality. Yep. And part of learning from other regions is hopefully going, well, we don't want to get there. Because actually, if we get to that situation, because we know we're going to get there. So I think the climate emergency is saying, we're going to get there.
Yeah, but it's an absolute fact.
Yeah, we're going to get there. 1, we're getting there quicker than we thought. 2, so if you thought you had 30 years, scrap that. So why are we still in the mindset of avoiding it when we know it's coming, where surely the conversation should be, and this is where the people power comes in, the community can influence some of these decisions, because that's what votes really. The power dynamic is you require your people to make a choice.
100%, I think it's about a lack of leadership and a lack of leadership from government. In fairness to the current government, they've inherited a lot of backtracking situations. You know, we reneged and also stalled and went backwards on a lot of our climate commitments. And that sends a really odd message, not just to industry in the UK, but also to international investors who might be thinking about putting their money into the UK, where you have no plan. You do not understand the crisis that's at hand. You know, we presented a really confused message internationally with regards to our approach to climate change. I think actually if we double down on renewable energy investment, if we double down on focusing about how we're going to support a green transition, what kind of economies are going to come out the other end of that, what kind of economic opportunities and emerging economies that can be supported with that, we'll see money flood back into the UK in terms of investing in a long-term plan, a long-term vision for the green transition and the green economy in the UK that actually has been really damaged by the last 6 or 7 years.
A change in priorities, essentially. I've always felt that with communities at the heart of everything. So if they're informed, if they're engaged, if they're part of that knowledge sharing that we do so well within professional spaces or talking to governments or policymakers, if our communities were part of that conversation, and we see that with the younger generation, there's a generation coming in going, we're not interested. We want our environment, our world to be our priority before anything else. If you can take that passion and that intelligence and marry them together, I feel like there's more accountability when it comes to holding your leadership to account, because you are then saying, this is what I want from my leaders and this is what I'm willing to vote for. So it creates that top down, bottom up.
I think we need to, in order to push it forward from a community level, or if you're part of a community, a smaller community that you really want to drive this forward, I think the way we've addressed it through activism is it's been good because it's increased awareness. But the challenge with that is that it's actually also polarized. It's been very niche in the things that it's focused on. The bit that we really need to get to grips with as the public now is understanding how everything's connected. You know, this amazing chaotic web of value and consequence and impact on our own lives. So, and we're feeling that every day, but we need some awareness, we need some education that says, actually, your food prices are higher because we're not addressing these elements of climate change. Your public health and your health is not as good as it could be because of air quality. And by the way, we could address that air quality if we had more green infrastructure. You know, we could address the mental health crisis if we had better, higher quality green infrastructure within our cities, because it would give people an outlet. It's been proven that it helps. So there's all these aspects that are really important to each of us individually, but we tend to focus on things like low traffic neighborhoods or super gluing ourselves to roads or other acts of activism, which raise awareness. But what we really need to be doing is playing our leaders at their own game in some sense and developing a compelling set of evidence that says there is a strong economic argument. We can regenerate our economy. We can regenerate our society. We can regenerate our community and our environment if we just understand that all of these things are linked together. And there'll be a domino effect if we get it right. The problem is at the minute is the domino effect's going in the other way. And the more that we take something else off the board, remove another green space, don't rely on Section 106 to go to higher quality green infrastructure in another area of your city, for example, we're not monitoring, we're not measuring with those SDGs in mind, particularly from, with SDG 11, the sustainable cities and communities. There's a number of elements within that actually, if our communities understood, oh, hang on a minute, my water quality is related to my physical health. It is related to the environmental health. At the moment, we're looking at extreme flood events, extreme heat events, and we're saying, oh, yeah, well, insurance companies aren't going to sort that out, aren't they? That's not the problem. The problem is that we have no plan around how to address this level of climate change.
Resilience,
resilience within our environment.
Is there part of this around otherness? In a conversation which should be about unifying and the bigger picture, people are almost stuck in their corner of the bit that's important to them. So it's kind of like, well, that's their issue because this is what I'm concerned about. And that's where the whole divide and conquer thing probably works really effectively, because then you can almost use those fears to put what should be a collaborative effort in opposing camps.
If you look at history, large corporations have been incredibly effective at making individuals and consumers feel responsible for the delivery of their own targets. You've got the whole recycling campaign by Coca-Cola that was actually didn't really address recycling or climate change or plastic waste, but it was an entire multi-billion-pound push during the 90s to say, well, why aren't you recycling? Individuals, public, why aren't you recycling? And actually that wasn't the problem. The problem is that there was no concerted centralized effort and leadership to get behind in order to say, well, actually that's a really good plan. It's going to make all of our lives better. Let's structurally change this. And that's the bit that we're missing, that emphasis, the evidence to structurally change our approach to climate change. And we need to build that evidence base. But I feel really confident that we're in a good place to do that. People now are more literate in terms of the environment, increasingly literate, should I say. But there are still entire communities, particularly in some of our most deprived areas, who, to be frank, have got much bigger, more acute worries to them than climate change. But they don't understand at the moment that climate change is going to play a part in all of those worries. It's going to increase energy bills. It's going to increase food bills.
The affordability and accessibility is a big part of this conversation. My first car was like a banger. I just wanted a car. And if someone had said, well, you could, if you got electrical, and let's not get down the road of whether they are or not, but if you go on the basis that they are an attractive option as a way of contributing towards these goals, so you get an electric car, and that way your emissions are much lower, and I understood that, but I was broke. And I just wanted something to wheel me from A to B with insurance I can afford. Like my priorities were a car. Can I afford the insurance? And how long can it stay on the road before I need a new one? And that particular car, I ran it to the ground. So I wasn't going to spend a ton of money on. And then you look at what the marketplace is doing, because they're so attractive, and the law of demand and supply is that those cars tend to be more expensive than the less environmentally friendly cars. And that's a very specific example, but people from vulnerable communities, and we looked at the stat earlier, I mean, these are people below the poverty line, it could be people living with disabilities, it could be elderly, less able people, those are the groups that we consider when we talk about vulnerability.
Yeah.
Their choices, their basic choices, just to have a normal life, already start at a place that we take for granted. And it can sometimes look like a choice.
But that's why we can't, we're having a discussion now about what can communities do and what can individuals do. I still think we cannot expect communities and individuals to change the narrative, to change the pace on this alone. Mm-hmm. And actually most of that effort, most of that work has to be done by central and local governments, because we need the initiatives. A really good example of this is international guidance for emergency shelter is currently rather nonsensical. It's a 3.5 meter squared area to bed down. It's potentially up to 500 people if there was a climate disaster or climate emergency in a church or sporting venue or community centre. And it's 2 days of water and 2 days of electricity, something there or thereabouts. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the tens of thousands of smaller climate disasters that have happened across the UK in the last 15 years, a large proportion of them have had people without electricity for way more than 2 days. Mm-hmm. There was one in 2019 that had a significant number of people without electricity for over 2 weeks, without fresh water for way more than 2 days. So all of these events are happening in our communities at the minute. They've been happening for a decade. You say, well, what do we do then? All right, well, we'll rely on community centres and we'll rely on sports venues. Well, we can't rely on sports venues because we saw in New Orleans, 16,000 people in a football stadium is a recipe for absolute carnage and disaster, and also required over 150 police or army to be there at the same time. Well, that's 150 service personnel that aren't in the community doing the thing that they need to do during a disaster. So that's not a plan. Community centres, well, where are the community centres? Because austerity in the last 10 years has really cut into where does the community gather. So there is an emerging plan here. Let's say that this could be an initiative by government, by local government, that says to address climate resilience, realistically, we need somewhere for 100 or 200 people to go. Well, we don't have that. So why don't we have a plan that builds these community centres? You look at somewhere like Newcastle, where we are now, 300,000 people here. That's hundreds of emergency shelters or community centres that we need. But if we reframe the problem, because the challenge you'll get is, well, we can't afford to do that. You say, well, that's fine. Well, let's look at the climate projections. Maybe it isn't hundreds, but maybe it's 60 in the most deprived, most at-risk areas when we look at flooding and heat escalation. Yeah. Okay. Well, we still can't afford to do it. What do we do with it? You can afford to do it because you can start to look at the compound effects of social care. Well, why don't we use it as a community centre? Why don't we use it for adult learning? Why don't we use it to bring social regeneration and regeneration to that community, help them to become more affluent in terms of, and upskill them in the workforce in those communities, so that those communities can then be generally more resilient. And then when this climate emergency happens, which is on the horizon, these centres are prepared. They have battery energy storage for a significant amount of time. They have renewable energy generation. That's a half of a plan made in 5 minutes on a podcast. There is no plan that even resembles that discussion happening at a local level in any city in the UK. And we're still just going to sit by and we're going to hit the window. We'll have the storms that come, and everybody will be like, oh yeah, well, and it'll be a utilities company. How bad is that utilities company? We love bagging on utilities companies.
Oh yeah. It's the thing to do at the moment.
It's the government scapegoat for not having a plan. But where's the plan to be able to say, this is a long-term plan? It's not a 4-year plan. It's not a 1-year funding window. It's a long-term plan that we are going to be the stewards of, that we are going to commit to, that has been developed with local industry, that has been developed with communities to say, right, do you know what? This deprived area in our city really needs an adult education centre. It could really do with a daycare nursery. It could really do with a public transport hub. It could really do with a community centre that might address loneliness in the community or aging in the community or social care of some other sort. But while we're putting that in place to benefit the community in the short term, why don't we think long term and turn it into a climate emergency shelter?
COVID. Mm-hmm. You just reminded me, because I remember when I got my call to go get my jab, and there was this whole center that popped up just off the A19. Massive, bespoke built hospital or something. And by the time I got around to it, there was that massive surge, and they had to build all these hospitals using money that they didn't have, but they found it. So back to your point, we don't have the money unless something happens, and then we have the money, and it would have cost them twice as much because it was a reactive response as opposed to a plan. Again, if we had an emergency plan for any kind of disaster, that would have been, but shoulda, woulda, coulda, back to the point. I remember thinking it was quite interesting because I think I had one of my jabs there, and then by the time the second jab came around, there was an announcement that some of those hospitals were coming down. So this extensive infrastructure came up, not sure how much it was used to capacity, and then it's gone. And you think, back to your point, if it had been considered in the way you're discussing, where you look at something that has a multifunctional current use, but that additional purpose in an event of, then if that was done right, that would still be there. It would still be operating as something we use on a daily basis. But in an emergency, not that would have another COVID, but if something else was to occur, and we live in a world where we know there's an emergency coming, so that is a reality, that type of infrastructure would give us some resilience.
COVID was such a mass global problem. And if this was the other side of the table, people would be right to say to me, it's not a doomsday, it's not a climate doomsday discussion. As much as I believe it is, that's what would come back. There were all these naysayers about the climate. And actually the real challenge here is it's not a big disaster that tips things over the edge. The power outage that lasted over a week in 2019 happened because we have an increase in storm activity. There were more storms. A lightning strike hit a substation and knocked it out. The cascade effect of that happening was that it just kept going on and on within the power network, within our decrepit and failing infrastructure as it currently stands. The domino effect of that one small incident that, granted, was bad, actually had this domino effect because the infrastructure had been underinvested in. Now you look at where we are in the UK now. Our water infrastructure is failing. Our power infrastructure is on its knees. We've got great renewable energy generation, but we can't actually leverage all of it because the power infrastructure is needing such a level of update. So we're doing some things really right, but we're not doing other things, like the things that are best for the communities and the cities in which we live. We're not making them more resilient.
So doing ourselves a disservice in the long run.
Absolutely. Well, just a lack of long-term planning.
Yeah. I visited this climate research facility in Teesside, and we talk about opportunities for carbon capture and that kind of, and I asked the question, and it was just, I grew up in a country called Cameroon, and in 1986, it's in everyone's memory if you were around that time, but there was a natural disaster. So they have these crater lakes, as you know, they trap carbon dioxide below the lake. And no one's quite sure how it happened, but on the middle of the night, one night, the waters, the lake dynamic moved, and it released carbon dioxide into the environment. And then what that did was it wiped out a whole village. And this conversation, why I bring it up, is this conversation was talking about the fact that we can move carbon from the atmosphere and then take it out to the North Sea and store it underwater. And I was like, I was like, how stable is that? And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, there have been these natural disasters on the other side of the globe. I happen to know about that because I grew up in the country, but this particular case study showed the other risk, which is what can be a resource can also be a source of disaster. And while we're pushing for innovation and we want to do that, it's having that foresight to consider the unintended. Absolutely.
I think one of the we've covered the the climate disaster and the downside and the inaction and the frustration quite well.
Yes.
But I think one thing to get across actually is that the level of opportunity is incredible. The level of economic opportunity and commercial opportunity for the UK and for other countries is absolutely incredible if we get it right. And a really good example of this, if we're going to go to that blue sky space that you've just talked about, is seaweed farming and macro and microalgae. But our approach to that is to say, well, for some unknown reason, let's go choose an area like Cornwall or Devon that has absolutely no visitors or tourism, and doesn't have an economy that's really dependent upon its marine leisure activities, and have everybody object to it again and again and again. And then the public news is, oh no, seaweed farms are bad. The last government's policy around what could we do with macro and microalgae, well, that was actually, let's turn it into fertilizer. Turning macroalgae into fertilizer is probably one of the worst uses for it on the planet. There is a hub, the Deep Green Biotech Hub in Sydney, who've got over 800 spin-outs. They've got 200 scientists that are working on new biochemicals for bioplastics, biofuels. That is an emerging economy. That is a high-value, high-skilled emerging economy that the UK just isn't part of at the moment. Because we think, we can have a little seaweed farm. That'll be quite nice. Low-skilled agriculture. It's not low-skilled agriculture. It's the potential for an entire supply chain of innovation, an entire supply chain that is high value. It's around R&D. It's around highly skilled lab work, jobs. It could really push the bioeconomy opportunities in the UK to the next level. But we're not there. So if we move from that high blue sky space, the bit we need to do first is just get the basics right.
And I think that's where projects like ours, the research and innovation, comes in, because it's creating the funding in a space where you can explore ideas and opportunities and hopefully build a plan that others can take on and deliver. And I did say I must introduce you to our sister project, Stronger Shores. Must do that. But yeah, I think that's it really. It's, I guess, looking at what we have at the moment, digital space, technological innovation, the biggest risk at the moment is sometimes these things run away from you. So safeguarding tends to be a big part of the conversation as well, isn't it?
Well, totally. I mean, look at the unintended consequences along those benefits as well. The key for me on getting the basics right, which is what we mentioned beforehand, is we are great at having a funding initiative that might last 12 months or 24 months in terms of an R&D funding initiative. Yes. It's fantastic. Local authorities bid into this. Everybody go and get a bit of money. By the way, by the time you've got the money, you've got 6 months to spend it or allocate it. And it actually also needs to encompass the R&D and the delivery of the project all at the same time. Yeah. And that's a perfect example of the lack of long-term investment and funding in these kind of initiatives.
What happens after the funding runs out?
Well, yeah, and or just make a plan that lasts a bit longer and have a longer vision that is underpinned by clear staged deliverables at every stage. And so we get excited about the technology. And I absolutely think technology will come through and will start to sequester carbon. It will help us on this journey. But if we continue to get the basics wrong, and we don't have our own organizations and our own local authorities working in the right areas, connected in the right places, on the right initiatives, then we're always going to have this siloing of measurement, metrics, reporting that actually it's just a duplication of effort. It costs twice as much because we're not all on the same page with what we're trying to achieve. And if you go back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think one of the really important things there is they've stood the test of time, which is quite unusual in this climate space. Everybody's referred to them. They haven't changed them. They haven't updated them. They've just kept them. Now, granted, nobody's made any progress that's really measurable or celebratory of any of the progress that's been made in any of those spaces. But there was nothing wrong with those fundamental key areas. Some of them might need a little update and a little tweak, but actually there's some key objectives there. And if we just stopped using it as the first 3 slides of corporate presentations or activity, we've declared a climate emergency. We have these climate goals. We'll be here by 2030. We'll be here by 2050. And we are aligned, and all of our activity is aligned with the SDGs. And I think we individually, in all of our roles, need to be asking, okay, just stop me there. How?
Yes. Exactly that. How? Because people have really pushed back to 2050.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people reporting to 2035 and 2050. And because this is another place we slightly disagree on. You feel that the goals are doing a good job. I think there's room for improvement.
I didn't say doing a good, definitely didn't say doing a good job.
I feel that the goals, I'm not saying change the goals. I think that the spirit of the goals are undisputed, essential they are. We need a joint end point. I agree that. I like the fact that we have the 17 goals. I do think that the completeness of the goals is perhaps something that needs to be reviewed.
I agree with that, absolutely. Because I think what it doesn't account for is our learning of the last decade. It doesn't account for things that have come to light. It doesn't account for things like mental health, like you've mentioned.
Exactly.
And that's come to the foreground as such an issue and such a problem. But also, and it doesn't account for some other things. But the things it does account for, I would put solidly in that bracket box of just get the basics right. And these are the basics. Now, I think we should add to them as and where we've learned that, hang on a minute, the basics are a bit more than those 17.
Yeah, because I guess we're coming from the same place, I think. Because my worry is if they remain the way they are and essentially stuck in how they were first written, then it puts us right back to how they came to be in the first place, which is they supersede what came before, which is the Millennium Development Goals. So it needs to be flexible and agile enough so it continues to evolve. And then you create that kind of, in itself, the sustainability of the goals that they keep in pace with.
I guess
the world.
From having worked on a few national strategies and plans, and they reached the start of our discussion, which was around about how are we still reporting such great progress on all these things. My main concern with them changing is it lets people off the hook. It says, oh, hang on a minute. And you can see the headlines. Every single government now comes out. Every single politician comes out of it.
Start from scratch.
We are wholeheartedly embracing this brand new standard that's rolled off the back of the UN SDGs, and then we'll spend the next 10 years talking about how we're embracing the new standard, instead of getting to grips with just action on the standard that already exists.
But I fear that's exactly what's going to happen if we carry on the way we're going.
But it's accountability. What we're lacking is responsibility and leadership and accountability and holding the people who can afford to be held to accountable. And, with the current government, that has to be big energy. It has to be water and utilities. We have to hold those companies to account.
But according to the report, energy is doing great. That's the point. It's become so commercially attractive that it's masking the bigger problem. There's 17 goals, and we're saying, well, look, that one's doing well.
Yeah.
And even with the water industry in the UK, there's water and sewage companies, because they can be and also different.
Yes,
water and sewage companies, we must use the term in completeness. I've had a bit of a vent on this as well, because the bigger conversation is around water quality. And the issues with surface water runoff and water quality are bigger than just the water and sewage companies. But again, with the headlines seem to suggest something else. And part of opening up the discussion and kind of just laying bare the details is providing that transparency.
But the really good point you made there around energy. Well, headlines are, we've got a lot of renewable energy provision, but then we're talking about one tiny column and part of that SDG. And this is where I'm going back to saying, well, we must have a plan that champions the delivery of all SDGs and understand the interrelation of them. Because, we've got renewable energy, but everyone's energy bills are still way too high, which then has an impact on how affluent each area, earning potential, educational attainment, which then has an impact on mental health and physical health. So the unintended consequences of this massive equalizer for a fair, and prosperous society and planet, which is the spirit of it, doesn't really work if you just say, oh, well, we do this one really, really well. We're focused on this one. You can't choose to be focused on one.
Yeah.
Because undoubtedly the one you're focused on, depending on how you're reporting on it, might have consequences for one or two other ones that totally diminish your contribution to that one.
Thank you so much, Olli. I think we could talk for far longer than that. So thank you for joining me today.
That's all right, mate.
Thank you for joining us on the PGN podcast today. For more details about what we've discussed, check out the notes that come with this episode. Project Groundwater, aka PGN, is a research and innovation project funded by DEFRA as part of the 200 million Flood and Coastal Innovation Programs managed by the Environment Agency. The programs will drive innovation in flood and coastal resilience and adaptation to a changing climate. This project is led by Gateshead Council with regional and national partners. PGN aims to enhance community resilience by developing and creating, mapping, forecasting and warning systems with a focus on groundwater flood risk, particularly in former mining areas within the region, but also on a national scale. With this funding, we're working on practical, innovative actions and knowledge sharing with our communities at the heart of it all. For more information on PGN, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.